Welcome to What If, So What, the podcast where we ask what's possible with digital and figure out how to make it real in your business. I'm Jim Hertzfeld.
And I'm Kim Williams-Chopek.
We're part of Perficient's digital strategy team. And today we'll ask what if, so what, and most importantly, now what?
25 years ago, consumers lined up at their local CompUSA to buy Windows 95, the operating system of the future. It cost about $210. That was the non-upgrade fee. Came in a cardboard box with a CD and a license key and the promise of unlocking the mysteries of this new digital age. While we can confidently say, looking back, that Windows 95 introduced the layperson to things like screensavers and the utility of Control-Alt-Delete, it did something to the software industry itself, transformed it. Today, we talk with Jeff Small, a product manager in the mobile practice at Perficient, about his career in digital product management, how the role of product manager has evolved in the past 25 years, and how organizations today should think about digital product management to outpace the competition. So Jeff, you and I both have backgrounds in product management, but tell us a little bit more about yourself and your history with product management.
Sure thing. I began my career way back in the Navy. That was where, after I graduated from high school, I was sort of directionless and wasn't really convinced about going to college at the time. So I joined the Navy, and that was probably my first experience with, electronics and technology. So I came out of the Navy and then went straight into college for computer science. And coming out of college, I started working at advertising agencies because at the time, that was where a lot of the great interactive work was being done. And I always sort of gravitated towards creative endeavors, right? That was just sort of where I felt like there was at least a passion. And so I was really interested in combining sort of the creative side and the technology side. And it always fascinated me. So I really gravitated towards agencies and kind of found a home at the time in ad agencies, which were exploding with interactive work, right? You had Flash, you had the internet, the web. So there was just a huge opportunity to do fun, creative work at agencies. So I spent a good portion of that time, probably close to a couple decades, working in various agencies, global agencies, et cetera, doing creative technology solutions and stuff like that for clients. And over the years, we built some amazing things. We built interactive digital signage. I've built Mario Karts for South by Southwest. We built an Apple Watch enabled barista experience for a coffee shop. So, just varied projects and jumping on various things and building various fun things. And then at a certain point, about 3 or 4 years ago, I started working with the United States Navy. So I was working with Recruiting Command to help recruit kids for the Navy. So that was we were working on all of the Navy's properties and sort of their portfolio of products. Navy.com and social platforms and things like that, and integrating all of that work. And so that was sort of the transition for me to start to manage a product portfolio, right? It's sort of like as a product manager for the US Navy.
That is great. It's such a rich history and experience. It's not a typical path going from the military to computer science and to agencies, and thinking about how each of those groups treat and define products. Which kind of leads me to my next question. How do you think the product management role has evolved, especially with what is called, and I'm using air quotes here, the modernization of digital product development?
That's a great question. And I think my hot take on it is I'm not necessarily convinced that the product management role has really evolved all that much. I think what's evolved is all underneath all of that, right? Modernization of platforms, they've evolved to the point where people are recognizing the need to actually manage these things as products. A while back, and going back maybe a decade or so, you just imagine the evolution when iPhones didn't exist, when smartphones didn't exist, APIs weren't around, so there was just no sort of like service-based architecture to do any of that. So it was a very bespoke time. Everything was sort of, you were rolling your own, you weren't using frameworks. It was just an early time and all of that stuff. And I think if you think about it, I'm using air quotes too, the software development lifecycle, that's always been a thing. That goes back to the 60s. People recognizing that you need to manage software development. I think this has been around for a while. I just think that the sea change underneath it is all of the integration work. These critical business systems that companies had, traditionally, they sort of locked all of that data up. Like that was all a very siloed environment, and all of that data was kind of locked away. And over the past decade, we've obviously seen sort of an opening of that data, and we've seen a lot of companies recognize that that data is not only important, it's intellectual property, and it can be productized, right? There's tremendous value in all of that data that had traditionally sort of been locked up and not made available. Once you sort of open up all of those integrations and you have these systems that are all talking to each other, you really have to elevate your game. You're no longer just building these little bespoke things. You're building rich integrations where at the end of the day, the user's experience or the customer's experience are really driven by all of that integration and how well all of that is managed.
I think it's a great point because I think the perception of a software product is something like, if you ask a layperson, like Microsoft Word or Quicken or something like that. And I think we've seen, I think you're right, via the evolution of these integrations and these frameworks and just open APIs, is that products themselves have been, let's say, redefined. So, in my past, I've restructured digital teams to define products as experiences, like you said. So you're in charge, hey, product manager, you're in charge of the checkout product. And it doesn't matter what channel it is, you're responsible for kind of driving the goals and objectives related to checkout. You're not responsible for building an app, you're responsible for that experience. Have you found that to be kind of the same evolution of a product definition, or do you think there's room for all of it?
Oh no, I think that's dead on. I think that's exactly correct, right? I think, do you remember Babbage's and CompUSA's? You remember that? You used to be able to go into a retail store and you could actually buy a physical box.
Yes,
And
right.
you would open up this box and there would be tons of cardboard and then there would be a disc in there, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Right.
So it was easy to wrap your head around the fact that that was a product, right? That felt like a real thing. You exchanged money, you walked out there with something in a bag and you felt that. And I think when the internet kind of first hit, it was difficult for people to sort of wrap their heads around downloadable and interactive and experiential things being considered products. The fact that that experience could sort of be considered part and parcel to the experience of the brand, or is the brand, like the experience is the brand, is relatively new, but you're seeing more and more people embrace it because they can wrap their heads around it. And I think a huge piece of that is our distribution mechanisms, right? Like the App Store didn't exist, Google Play didn't exist. There was that operational or that experience of, I'm going to go to this storefront, right? I'm using air quotes again, this storefront, and I'm going to get this product and download it and install it. I think it kind of helped people kind of transition towards the idea of like, okay, well, these definitely are products. And then, of course, the 800-pound gorilla in the room, Apple is just sort of like the gold standard of the idea of like, the experience is the brand. The operating system is Apple. Your experience on that phone is Apple. Apple very clearly understands that that is their brand, that is their product. Your experience and your emotional connection to that device and how you navigate through that and how you touch that device and hold that device is really the Apple brand experience. That is them.
That's the brand. Yeah, you're so right. And it kind of makes me think, to your point, product management as a discipline has been around, but maybe the skill set has evolved a little bit because the definition of a product has evolved. Do you think that's true? And if so, what kind of skills do product managers need today?
Um, I think you need vision. Top and foremost, I think is the idea that you need to have a broader view than just sort of what it is that you're delivering right now, or what it is that you're making, or what it is that you're doing. You have to have empathy and sort of understanding, because you have to make sure that you're keeping the users in mind, and that requires a tremendous amount of empathy to understand pain points and friction. I think creativity is huge. You're looking at systems and solving problems, and I've always believed that engineers are some of the most creative people around, right? Like, you're creatively problem solving and building things.
It's a great point. Creativity doesn't necessarily mean art. There's creativity in development and design and writing code. Yeah,
Yep.
definitely.
Yep. And the way that you solve a problem or the elegance in which you do something, I think those are all creative things. And then I think leadership is really big too. And I think that's sort of, that goes alongside of the sort of like accountability and empowerment thing, right? You want to make sure that you have a decision maker and that you're empowered to make those decisions, and that you're leading the team and you're providing a vision and a North Star, and you're making it easy for everybody to know where it is that you're going. Like, I always remember, it's a big responsibility. And I always remember the great Spider-Man quote, with great power comes great responsibility. You have all this power. You have to exercise it responsibly, right? You have to be a leader. You have to be a rock. You have to be accountable. You have to be empowered. So I think it's all of those things, especially when you're dealing with, large, complex systems. You have to navigate internal bureaucracies. You have to navigate external bureaucracies. You have to navigate real engineering challenges. You have to kind of manage all of that. And it kind of takes, I feel like it takes a real steady hand.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. So let's assume that you have all these skills. You're a product manager. How do you apply them on a day-to-day basis? And really, because we are in a pandemic right now, has your day-to-day changed since the pandemic?
It's changed in ways I can't even imagine, right? Like, I couldn't even imagine in February we'd be having this conversation looking back on this past year. I was in a very, I don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate, but I was in this position in early February where we were really just launching a project with a client. And I think it was challenging for all of us to kind of navigate those early days and to sort of figure out a cadence and a communication. And I think that's probably the key thing. So day to day, it was discovering how to navigate the Zoom ecosystem. It was in the Teams ecosystems and things like that to sort of coordinate, managing things like Jira to allow access. So I think the day to day part of it is just right now feels very Groundhog Day, but that's for everybody, right? Like, everybody's feeling that.
Yes,
Um,
affirmed.
And then I think my day to day is the other thing that I've noticed about Teams conversations, and I don't, you can weigh in here too, because I would love to hear your experience, is that you really can't be a wallflower. I think in meetings, when you're face to face with people, there are opportunities where you may not necessarily contribute directly to the meeting, but verbal cues, looks and glances, and just being in the room and acknowledging conversations. I think there's a lot of that you can do without sort of like actively participating in the conversation. But I think with Teams and all of this remote work, you really just can't be a wallflower, right? If you've got something to say, you need to say it. If you've got an opinion, you need to state it. If you feel like there's a challenge or an issue, you need to bring it up. And so I think one of the biggest challenges I've had is sort of nudging members of my team to bring those things up. Like, I guess that's it. You just can't be a wallflower in this environment.
Yeah, it occurs to me. It's interesting because when we talk about modern product management, a lot of times the assumption is we're using these agile methodologies and processes, which demands team empowerment and total trust and accountability. But maybe the fact that, to your point, everybody's now being forced to work remotely and they can't have these in-person interactions, there's a demand to really call on those tenets and say, if you're not going to speak up, I need to know that I can trust you in other ways. And I don't know, it does occur to me that that's calling on kind of the proof points of agile in some of these cases when we're working remotely.
Right. I mean, if you remember, sort of the core tenet of Agile is communication over documentation. So it's the idea that you're fostering communication. And I think this has been absolutely one of those sort of, like to say, the rubber meets the asphalt. This is where you prove all of that out.
Maybe that's regional. I've always heard where the rubber meets the road, but we're
Okay.
from different parts of the
Right.
country, so I get it. I get it. Um,
Right.
so you talked a little bit, and I think you're spot on. Product managers today have to be empathetic, of course, but have to be sort of like UX designers in their spare time. How do you ensure, as a product manager, you have the right audience identified and their needs identified before you begin product design?
Oh man, that's a really great question as well. I think the answer is, and I sort of go back to the idea of having kids. I use this analogy a lot. I remember when we were younger, right? When everybody's younger, just getting out of college, everybody is sort of like planning to have kids. You don't plan to have kids, right? Everybody, I remember that time in my life where it just felt like we need to have everything in place before we have kids. And you have your first child and then you realize you can't prepare for this. Like, there's no prep for this. So it's similar in the sense that you kind of have to jump in and make things. You do have a North Star. I'm not saying that you just sort of willy-nilly jump in and start making things. But I think you can't necessarily plan for everything to be perfect before you start a project. In my head, I'm kind of going to my current experience on a project I'm on. I think for whatever reason, knowing who the audiences are, I sort of fall on the side of I always just want to prove out hypothesis. So I don't necessarily view having all of the answers as a requirement going into it. You have your strategy, planning, and user needs in place. You're doing your planning and analysis, but iteration is a huge thing right now, right? Like, you want to rapidly iterate. Just in prepping for this, what I thought was really interesting was, just for the heck of it, I went and looked up Facebook on the App Store, and I'd like you to guess what version of Facebook is currently in the App Store. Go ahead, take a guess.
Version.
Yeah, what
Gosh,
what
I
version?
wouldn't even know. I have it's been years, I think,
Right,
since I downloaded the Facebook app.
right. They're on version 299 right now of the Facebook app.
Wow. Wow.
They're releasing an update every 2 weeks. That tells me that they're proving a lot of hypothesis. They're doing a lot of testing. They're doing a lot of iteration. They're doing a lot of learning about what makes a product successful while they're doing that, right? I think that's a great example of that.
That is a great point, and it's like define the questions that you're trying to answer, and then that'll give you the direction. And Facebook's a great example because if you do use the app, you quite frequently see updates to the app, and it always seems to be a little bit of a uproar about, oh, I hate this new version, or why can't they do it the way they did it? But that uproar tends to die down pretty quickly, depending on the news cycle of the day.
And then a month later, people are up in arms if you remove that feature, right?
Right.
Like people were
That's
like,
so
I
funny.
became dependent on that. So,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
you're going to go into this with hypothesis, and your hypothesis are going to be based on, you're not just going to sort of randomly put your hand in a hat and come up with hypothesis. So you're going to have a sense of like, who you need to be talking to, and what their pain points are, and jobs to be done and things like that. You'll do all of that work and you'll have a good sense of it. But don't think that all of that needs to be buttoned up to begin, I think is what I'm saying. You don't go into it confident that you have the answers. You go into it posing the right questions.
That's right. That's great. So I'm curious. And Facebook's another great example. We talk a lot with our clients who are trying to move faster about kind of this promise of modern product development and some of the key capabilities to achieve this promise. So we hear that, and we talk a lot about speed, quality through automation, and like I mentioned before, kind of team empowerment and team autonomy. Do you think these are the right capabilities? Is this promise real?
Yeah, I mean, I think operationally, all of it moves very, very quickly. You have to match the speed, I think, of the current sort of operational environment that we're all in. I can write an app and release it to an audience of millions of people in a couple of days. That idea of being able to, of having to develop a piece of software, test it, do all of the work before you finally build something that you have to make a gold master of, and then you have to go off and burn a DVD or CD of. Remember those days, or put it on a disc or whatever? All of that timeline has just shrunk to zero. So, you're talking about a months long cycle of a product delivery that just has been shrunk down to, I hate to use the word literally, but literally zero, right? You can turn things around in real time. So it is all about speed, and speed should enable everything else. Going back to the hypothesis question, you can very quickly find an answer, right? So you should be looking to very quickly find an answer. All of the automation and testing is really sort of a means to an end, right? It just enables the speed. It's all of this sort of system that was built up to sort of address the fact that the speed is there. And so I get it. Organizations and operations don't operate at this speed. So it's very unnerving and very hard to kind of wrap your brain around the fact that you can move that quickly.
So if you're moving that quickly, and we're talking about these promises, how do you measure? What are your KPIs? How do you know when you've been successful beyond just getting to market quicker?
You're always going to have the appropriate KPIs, right? But I think there's this sort of intangible KPI around this, and they're all sort of related about whether or not, one of the things about product management, or the way that I like to think of it, is that it's this system of delivering products. You're researching, you're testing, you're building. It's this whole iterative circle. And so I think one of the things that you have to do is you have to be focused on sort of tweaking that circle. So are we hitting our KPIs? Are we making everything? Are we addressing our users' needs? Are we addressing the friction points? Are we solving business problems? There are always those. But then I think there's these sort of intangible pieces that you have to kind of keep in mind. And this relates directly to sort of that promise, is that you have to keep tuning that team. If you're going to be testing things, you have to make sure that your analytics team is in lockstep, or you have to make sure that you're plugged in with the strategy folks, because you're testing things that are strategic questions. These are strategic business questions and strategic experience questions that you have to get answers to, and you have to provide those answers back, because you're not doing this sort of in a bubble to kind of just find out answers. You're doing them to solve problems. So if someone higher up is sort of posing you these strategic questions, you need to make sure that your team can address those questions and answer those in an appropriate way, and that your system and solution is sort of tuned to being able to do that. So I think that's kind of the intangible piece of it that I feel like is sort of attached to that piece of like the promise of product management and the promise of agile and the promise of speed and the promise of delivery. That's my POV.
Yeah. And I just have to go back to one of the biggest challenges I've seen, and tell me what you think. It all comes down to this notion of trust and team empowerment, and however it gets rolled out in an agile fashion. I've seen most organizations really struggle, really struggle with this notion of truly autonomous teams and truly empower them. Have you been able to accomplish that? Any gotchas or lessons learned? Because I think without that true team empowerment, or at least like you said, this tweaking of continuous improvement around team empowerment, I just don't see how we achieve the promises of modernization of product development.
That goes right back to that leadership question, right? I think this is a leadership question if there ever was one. I think in my personal experience, my agency background was really helpful in sort of evolving into sort of the product manager role. I've watched very skilled leaders sell ideas to clients that just can't grok them, right? They can't wrap their heads around them. I think it's really interesting. My experience has been that I've sort of seen the unsellable be sold, or I've seen concepts that are hard for businesses to wrap their heads around be sold. So I've seen that all of that goes back to exactly what you said, which is trust. I think the key to all of that is trust, right? Your goal is to be a trusted advisor. People, your team, your clients, everyone that you're in contact in should count on you, and they should count on you to be real. Don't be cynical. Don't be artificially rosy. You just need to be real. And I think that you really just need to over-index on building trust. No one's ever going to hand you the keys to something without that trust. So before you can even have conversations about empowerment, you have to make sure that the trust is there. That would be like your kids asking you for the car. You have to be able to trust that before you can hand those keys over. Building the trust is super important. And I think the gotchas are really the other side of that coin. When you're empowered, the buck stops with you. So you have to really embrace that, and you have to understand that you're going to fail. You're going to miss a date. You're going to build things that may or may not work right. You may go over budget. Things will go south, but that's okay. It's all opportunities to sort of show your mettle. It's important that everybody remembers that, every time you go through something, it's not the thing that harms you, or it's not the thing that impacts you. It's your reaction to the thing that impacts you.
Completely
Right.
agree. Right.
So those
Yes.
things are going to happen, like, miscommunication, things aren't going to work. All of those things are going to happen. And those are sort of the other flip side of the empowerment coin. You're agreeing to take on all the responsibility of that, which means that in order to do that, you have to be trusted to do that. You have to be real. You have to be honest. You can't sugarcoat things. But at the same time, you're not there to be Debbie Downer the entire time.
Right. It's how you manage the response,
Correct.
or in other parlance, it's not the crime, it's the cover up. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yep.
So, kind of wrapping up, I'd love to get your take. If an organization, is starting to implement what they, in their mind, the vision is a modern product management practice, with all the promises of, speed to market, quality, automation, team autonomy, what's the biggest piece of advice you would give them?
I mean, I think it's the mantra of failing fast, right? You need to be able to get ideas, user value, features out in the world as quickly as possible. You're just going to talk about them ad nauseum until you get them out there. Everybody knows what the right thing is to do. Everybody's got their opinion about like the right direction or the right solution or the right idea, but you got to implement it. You got to do it. You got to build that thing or test that experience or validate that hypothesis. You can't just sort of endlessly talk in a circle around it. And then I think to that point, you sort of have to live by the hypothesis. You have to understand that you're constantly testing, you're constantly reducing friction, you're constantly, asking questions about jobs to be done and what your users are trying to do and what you're trying to accomplish. And so you're always trying to reduce friction. If there's even a minor pain point, you should be looking to iron those out. So live and die by the hypothesis. You're setting out to prove or disprove things. When I'm in these conversations and everybody sort of knows what the solution is, in the back of my head, I'm thinking, all of this is a hypothesis until it's proven out. All of this is just conjecture. Like, I think this will work, or, and that's the thing. People don't use the word think. If people use the word think more, it'd be clear. I think this is the solution, or I think this is what our users want. That's a pretty powerful word to inject into that conversation. Last thing is be curious. Organizations have an obligation to sort of be curious. They have to understand, like, where's the next horizon? Where is our business going? Where are our users going? What are their experiences? Where are they more than likely to engage my brand or be a touch point? Or where do I influence them? So I just think you can't ever stop asking questions. Always ask questions.
That's fantastic. Well, thanks, Jeff. This was so fun to talk to you about this, our shared experiences. And I know you're living this on a day-to-day basis. So I really, really enjoy the conversation and all your insights. And I'd say to you today, go out and find a site that is still running Flash and see if you can get it to work.
That's a great one. I think I probably have some bookmarks I could locate.
Great. Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, this was terrific. Thank you, Kim. I appreciate your time.
Now it's time for our namesake segment, What If, So What, and most important, Now What? Jim, Jeff has such great background and experience in digital product management. What were your biggest takeaways around how his discipline has shifted its purpose over time?
Hey, Kim. Well, first of all, I could listen to Jeff read the phone book because
I
he's
know.
got this sort of natural, just the way he speaks, and just he's just there's such eloquence and sort of a natural flow of what's so obvious to him, and he just really makes it obvious. So I just
Right.
so glad he was on the call, and I hope he's listening. Um, no, it was great. I think the thing that stands out to me is the idea of the value of iterative delivery, which is so at home from a purely development standpoint. We talk about agile and we talk about developers and what it's the life of a developer in an iteration, but extending that to the product role in the product owner right role, which is so critical, which I'll come back to. But I think I was talking to a team not long ago about what they called high risk product development. They're really trying to innovate, they're really trying to find something new, and they felt like the only way to do this safely and to innovate well is to figure it all out up front. And I'm thinking to myself, man, is what year is this? You don't need all the answers to get started. In fact, you're going to miss the answers, but you think you can get them all. So I just think, over and over again, the value of iterative delivery. And in fact, he mentioned Facebook. I got to check this now, but it was on version 299. And this is the value of testing and learning. And then I just thought that's so important to keep coming back to that and like why those techniques are so important. I mentioned the product owner, but I think we really got to think about the product manager because in some ways agile has sort of warped the product owner role into just a BA, and it's so much more than that. So he kind of dug in and got into sort of the value of integration and how that's been able to really transform the product manager and hope the product owner role. I thought that was really that why was really important. Like, this is why this has happened. So, and I think that really resonated with you too, Kim. But yeah, what did you think?
Yeah, so it's funny because I definitely have seen in some organizations the product owner be this glorified BA, and that's I think a pathology that needs to be rooted out.
Strong word.
Yeah, yeah. Well, but
I
I think
agree.
that the purview of a product manager, product owner, I'm going to call it, has really grown tremendously. You're right. Jeff talked about the sea change being the layer of integrated systems underneath, which certainly Windows 95 didn't have. But the product owner needs to have the product vision. They need to have that vision, but they really also need to understand how to build and enable a team that understands, builds, and runs, and kind of all the implications of owning a living product. And I don't think that you can be a product manager or this glorified BA without those leadership skills. And I think the skill set has changed because the definition of product has evolved, going from, the standalone package in a box with a license key to, a truly living, breathing product that can go from version 299 to 301 in a week. And I think that's so important. And I think my other takeaways here is it doesn't sound like you can truly implement modern practices and these agile methodologies if you really don't embrace and have a culture that supports and encourages the principles these demand, like true ownership, true accountability. You can embrace that failing fast, ethos, but you have to know what success and failure criteria looks like. And I think Jeff called that out as like, what's the hypothesis? And that allows you to get away from that waterfall because you've defined that hypothesis, and you know what you're chasing after, and then you know how to correct it pretty quickly. Those are my biggest takeaways.
Well, Kim, I'll get to what I think is the what if question here, and I'll just rewind it because I think when we think about product management, which has come up so much, in the last just few years, and I think a lot really in the last couple of years, I think a lot of our clients are talking about it. But I like to go back to sort of an evolution of how we got here, and why it matters from a digital and customer experience perspective. But I think if you go back, way back to the beginning, you had a system, right? And you had a few users. Maybe it was just the accounts payable team, right? But you had this sort of monolithic system, and it stood on its own, and it had a very linear process, and maybe supported a really core part of the business, and it didn't change a lot. It's just so we invented, but we had to invent the software development lifecycle, right? And that's where waterfall came from, and that was fine for a lot of systems. But then companies got more systems, so they had two, then three, then five, then 10, then 50 of those systems kind of doing their own thing. And then eventually they started to, they needed to talk to each other. And when we wanted to make a business change, you had to manage all of those implementation dependencies. And we invented PMOs, and people got PMI certified, and that was a big deal for a while. There were PMPs everywhere. You don't see a lot of those anymore, but you had to have that kind of discipline, and that kind of drove everything because they were complex demands, and those systems just weren't capable of talking to each other. And I remember, it's kind of a funny story, but I remember I worked for a company that had this complex enterprise project management system, and you would build your schedule and put your resources in, and then it would calculate, when people were going to work.
Yes.
Remember those days? And I remember I did that once,
Yes.
and my project, I swear to God, it was probably a 3-month project, and it calculated it was going to be done in 23 years. So I thought, and I think everyone said this isn't working. So, and then eventually the technology catches up. So I think Jeff's point was so spot on about integration, and then service oriented architecture came up, and loosely coupled architectures, and APIs are born, and everything kind of catches up. And now we can operate in that manner where we can be more iterative and more customer focused. So I think the big what if for me was, what if you could deliver anything as soon as it was valuable? Like, I have an idea and I can get it out there in days, or I have a problem, I can get it solved in days. Like, if I could add some value, no matter how small, how fast can I get it out there? And I think that's ultimately what product management approach is trying to solve. So what's the so what?
Well, so to your point, I think the big so what here is if you can get to market faster, if you have all these systems and processes and loosely coupled architectures, you can actually be more responsive to customers, market events, competitors. You can really live by that PSI, that potentially shippable increment. I mean, that is the value that these modern practices and disciplines bring. And really the benefits to the business and the customer are the same. It's that speed to market with that quality aspect. And I can't emphasize that enough. We're we're living in a week where Cyberpunk 2077 got released and then yanked because of the bugginess, and that's almost unheard of in the gaming market. But they're using agile methodologies just like every other company, so it's an interesting case study. But I think to get there, and I'll go back to some of the things that Jeff talked about, you have to start with the outcome. How do you transition from a traditional organization that follows a waterfall process and is very risk averse to modern technologies, modern principles, modern release thinking? You really have to start by focusing on the outcomes, understand where you're going, and then kind of reorganize the teams based on the outcomes that you want to achieve, not the market or channel. I still see teams organized by market or channel. And a simple example is, I'll just go back to the one I used. Checkout. Well, is it, in a retail B2C commerce site, is it checkout on a native app? Is it checkout on the site? Well, there's two different teams. You end up with two totally different checkout experiences, two totally different ways those channels integrate back into the order management system. It just kind of defeats the purpose of this unified view. I think then modern design and development processes, we talk a lot about now with our clients, research ops, both qualitative and quantitative. How do you really operationalize those and fit them into agile methodologies? Design ops needs to be there. DevOps is kind of I'm using air quotes, an older notion in modern product management, but if it's not planned to align with the outcomes you're going for, you're going to be in trouble there. And I think the reason why all of these modern processes like design ops and DevOps really work in the companies they are working for is because you have that culture that really structures and kind of walks the talk of those leadership practices that are focused on accountability and customer obsession. So I keep going back to, it's a product owner, not a product manager, certainly not a BA, really living that life of team empowerment and accountability that's tied directly back to outcomes, and then really thinking about incentive-based compensation for those teams. I mean, you talk about empowerment and accountability with teams. The incentive-based compensation is a really nice way to put your money where your mouth is, literally, as an organization. And I go back to the Cyberpunk 2077 example where they, halfway through the release, made an announcement that the developers weren't going to be compensated in what they originally were told they were going to be. And I think there was a lot of controversy over that, but it made sense to me in my mind. Maybe it was too little too late and it was reactionary. Clearly they have some issues in how they have their organization structured, but the idea, I think, is the right way to be thinking about it when you're thinking about outcomes.
I'm sorry, I had to ask, is Cyberpunk available on Windows 95? I'm just asking for a friend. Okay.
Probably. I bet it works on Windows
Okay.
95 too. You have to get a pirated license key from your friend down the street to
Okay.
run it.
I'm in.
That was a different lifetime. Um, so what can you do today as an organization? I think, ask yourself, do you understand how individual experiences within a product ladder up to the overall KPIs? What are those experiences that drive the outcomes? Are there owners for each of those experiences? Is there one person accountable for checkout? And if not, how can you get there? If there are, do they know what their targets are? Do they know what their baselines are and what they're shooting for? That do they own those outcomes and do they feel empowered to drive to them? I hate to say it, but I think a lot of managers would say yes, and a lot of product owners would say no. And certainly before putting any new technologies or methodologies in place, really start by examining the organization and the culture to know how to drive true agility. I know, Jim, you've seen this too, a 2-year long project that focuses on training and implementing agile in an organization that ends up failing because you don't have those cultural underpinnings. And I think that's the most important thing to do. It sounds boring because we're not talking about technology or releasing product, but you can't underestimate the importance of that empowerment piece of bringing a product to market.
Reminds me of someone told me years ago, the soft stuff is the hard stuff. And
That's
yeah,
absolutely true.
yeah, more change management.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Jim, for the conversation as always, and maybe we could upgrade to Windows 98. If I recall, that was less buggy.
I think I still have the floppy disks. So, what's a floppy disk? Somebody's asking. All right. Awesome. Thanks, Kim.
Thanks, Jim.
Yep. Next time.
You've been listening to What If, So What with Jim Hertzfeld and Kim Williams-Chopek. Subscribe to the podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. You can find this season, along with show notes, at Perficient.com. We're also on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, Google, and other major podcast platforms. Thanks for listening.